Welcome to the Good Faith Podcast. I'm your host, Curtis Chang, and the Good Faith Podcast is a production of Redeeming Babel, and it's where friends who follow Jesus help each other make sense of the world. And recently, when I've been launching the after party into the world, I've been getting more and more a question that asks this: Curtis, how bad is it going to get this year? Now, that question of how bad it's going to get really depends on what you mean by bad. If bad means your political candidate of choice may lose and the other guy wins, well, I don't know the answer to that question. And speaking with my after party hat on, that partisan based definition of bad, it's not a question that the after party really seeks to answer. But there is a definition of bad that the after party is seeking to address. I hope that anyone listening out there, regardless of what your partisan loyalties are, would agree that it will be bad if political violence occurs. If politics causes people, including Christians, to inflict physical harm and even death on each other, that will be very, very bad, especially from God's perspective. So, how bad could things get? Can this election season actually get violent? And if so, what can we do about it? That's the question for today's episode, and I have the perfect guest to help us answer this important question. It's Elizabeth Neumann. Elizabeth served previously as the Assistant Secretary of Counterterrorism and Threat Prevention at the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. So she's an expert in assessing how bad the threat of violence can get. And she's currently the Chief Strategy Officer at Moonshot, a really innovative nonprofit that we're going to talk about trying to respond to this threat. She's also the author of a new book, Kingdom of Rage: The Rise of Christian Extremism and the Path Back to Peace. Elizabeth, welcome to the Good Faith Podcast.
Curtis, it is such an honor to be able to join you around the campfire.
Well, you know about the campfire. I've gotten to know you, and you've been a part of the Good Faith campfire for a while, haven't you, Elizabeth?
That's right. I consider myself a plank holder. I have been listening to Good Faith since you guys launched in 2021, back in the dispatch days, and it is truly a thrill, actually, to be able to join you.
And by the way, listeners, if you don't know what plank holder means, apparently it's a government term that refers to you were there when the planks were laid down. I guess it's the Navy term. And so it's true. Elizabeth was when we were just laying down the foundations of the Good Faith podcast. She was there. And so it's a joy for me to welcome her, really overdue as an invitation to have her as a guest. All right, Elizabeth, let's jump into it. You have a professional background in assessing the danger of violence. Can you explain your professional background in this activity?
So I was a part of the George W. Bush administration's Homeland Security Council. So right after 9/11, a whole bunch of new government entities were created, the Department of Homeland Security, the Homeland Security Council, and I was one of the original staff members of that council. And we were doing policy work. And I actually knew how to do policy work and I could write. And so I was kind of like their policy assistant, and I would do they would describe what they wanted to fix, and then I would go and translate it and make it happen. So I did their grunt work for them. And in exchange, I learned from some really remarkable people. And it kind of stuck. I stayed with it even after the George W. Bush administration, did various roles for state governments, for the federal government as a contractor. And then most recently, I was asked to come back during the Trump administration. I was living in Dallas with my 2 young children at the time, and my husband was like, "No, I don't want to go back to DC." And we said no twice. And then the third time, it kind of pulled on my mission heartstrings, if you will, that there was, it was a dangerous time, and there weren't a lot of people with experience going in. So I did. I did go back in and I worked for Secretary John Kelly. He was the first Secretary of Homeland Security. We ended up having 5 during my tenure.
A
And
tumultuous period for that
yes,
department.
it was. And so I served in 2 roles. I served as the Deputy Chief of Staff for John Kelly, and then later moved over to our policy office and was the Assistant Secretary for Counterterrorism.
And what years were you there? Were you there the entire Trump administration or just part of it?
Almost 2017 through spring 2020. So right as COVID was hitting, I was leaving. I had been both pressured by my husband to leave, so it was like part of the plan, but then also kind of was being simultaneously pushed out because that's what was happening to all of us who either had ties to the Bush administration or ties to John Kelly or said no too many times. Yeah, 2020 was the period where they started pushing everybody out who was not compliant enough.
Yeah. Where do you identify yourself in the various Christian streams that are out there?
I consider myself an evangelical mutt, meaning I have been in many, many different evangelical church traditions, but mostly from the conservative theological standpoint. Grew up in North Dallas, so think Bible Belt. Southern Baptist, Presbyterian, Bible, lots of non denominational Bible churches. And then as an adult, PCUSA, PCA, also Southern Baptist, also non-denominational megachurch types. So I've been in lots of different spaces. The other piece I would say is I'm kind of from that intellectual heady side of evangelicalism. So lots of Bible study that are in depth, hour long homework type, or like my husband and I on car trips, we listen to sermons, right? Like, so we're kind of nerdy.
Yeah.
And I like to be
That's pretty much
transparent
the
about
core
that.
audience of the Good Faith podcast, I
Okay.
think.
Okay. I feel seen.
Well, Elizabeth, one of the things I love talking with some of our guests is just picking up very quickly how God has created the individual guest with their unique life story for the work that they are now doing in the world. And it strikes me for you as somebody who has clearly risen to the very tops of threat assessment of political violence in your professional expertise, combined with a deep knowledge of the Christian world and of the faith commitment in the Christian world, along with your, past membership in Republican administrations. Like you're like the perfect person to write this book, Kingdom of Rage. And I want to just read for our listeners the dedication to it, because I think it will give you readers and listeners a sense of your heart behind this book. And the dedication says this: the book is dedicated to the exhausted, tribeless, remnant of exiles. You are not alone. Take heart. He has overcome the world. It's a beautiful dedication. Elizabeth, connect the dots from that dedication to this book that follows that dedication. What's the linkage there?
I had this moment after January 6th, and I was living in DC at the time, of remembering that after 9/11, we had asked a lot of the Muslim community. We asked them, moderate Muslims, to teach their faith, to expound upon their scriptures and show where the jihad does not have to be violent, that this is not a mandate. It kind of felt that if we asked of the Muslim community to do that after 9/11, that the Christian and conservative community had a similar burden. By saying that, that does not mean that all Christians and conservatives are responsible for what happened on January 6th or for other examples of targeted attacks, terrorist attacks that have come from what we define as the far right extremist movement. But we are adjacent to, and increasingly, as I lay out in the book, we are more, the extreme is more mainstream. It is more interconnected than it used to be even 10 years ago. And so if it is in our midst, we have a responsibility to recognize it and to denounce it and to push it out. And I believed that if we were going to do that, then I had a need to be able to help people see why I was seeing it that way from a professional perspective, but also to something that we can do now that we couldn't do post 9/11, is we have so much evidence about why people move to extremism in the first place, and it turns out it's really not about ideology. It's not about the narratives create this permission structure, but it's not the underlying driver. The underlying driver are psychosocial factors that have led to somebody being vulnerable to those narratives. And so the good news for our community is that it's not just a message of we need to push back against anywhere where people are justifying violence, or that hostile action is a way that we resolve our grievance and our frustration, our fear. It's also a message of, in good news, we can actually build resilience in our community. And the ways you build resilience, it sounds an awful lot like what Jesus taught. It actually, the more I dug into it, what social science tells us about people that can resist extremism, it actually looks a whole lot like what, if you're studying scriptures and what Paul says to do, how we endure suffering, or how we walk through trials, or how we encourage one another, and how we need to be in community. All of those things align with what the social science now tells us. So it really was, in some ways, it felt like a burden, like I needed to explain this, but then also kind of an excitement of, oh, we can do something about this. We can actually reduce the amount of violence we are seeing in this country. And what a joy that the church actually has the tools already in-house to be able to do this mission of making our community safer.
Well, Elizabeth, I think you've laid out your book, and I think the message that we want to just cover in this conversation. I love the idea that we want to end up with good news, and you actually do have good news to share. Your last half of the book is basically a description of how the church, like you said, is actually well equipped to be the good news here in this threat of extremist violence. And so I want to get to that, but as is so much the case with the gospel, the good news is good only after you've recognized the bad news. And so I want to kind of cover both, but I do think we need to cover the bad news, or the sobering warning news. And I really like how you're setting up the warning as with a historical precursor to 9/11. I'd never heard anybody say that before, but that there is a straight line connection in one sense from 9/11 to January 6th. Just like you said, after 9/11, we by sort of the American thought leadership of populace, we called on thoughtful Muslims to renounce violence amidst voices within their own extremes that were calling for violence. And that we felt like that was a legitimate way to partner with that religious community. January 6th is like the 9/11 moment for Christian extremism, Christian nationalist violence. And similarly, we need to do the similar move of calling on ourselves and our own community to actually properly delegitimate that January 6th call to violence. So that all makes sense. So let's do that. And let's start by first defining the terms clearly, because your subtitle is The Rise of Christian Extremism. Define that term, Christian extremism. What is an extremist, and what is particularly a Christian extremist?
So extremism, the definition I use in the book, is when a person or a group perceives a threat to their success or survival by an outgroup. So it's like your us-them context, and therefore hostile action is necessary. The hostile action piece is really what sets apart the us-them, which is quite frankly the norm in our politics,
right? Yeah.
The norm in our living these days. We've increasingly, all the data tells us we're just very polarized. We sort ourselves and the way that we view others through our politics. It's really, that alone is very, very unhealthy, but that's not extremism. What's extremism is when we take that us-them context and our conclusion is not, I need to go vote, or I need to go listen to somebody else's perspective, or I'm going to go raise money for my political candidate of choice. All of those are legitimate ways to deal with, maybe not always the healthiest, but legitimate ways to deal with our us-them concerns. But when you move into a solution set that involves hostile action, you're moving into extremism.
By
And
hostile, you
hostile,
mean physically hostile, right? Like,
well, actually, I define it a little bit broader than just the
okay.
physical. The lower end of the spectrum is includes harassment, bullying,
Mm,
intimidation, and
okay.
threats.
Yeah.
And that's really important because government can't police that, right?
Right.
There are certain civil penalties, like you could sue somebody if they harass you enough. You can get a restraining order, but it's actually quite hard to
Yeah.
use the law to police that non-criminal space. But the lower end of the spectrum moves into the mid end of the spectrum, which might be vandalism of property, some types of hate crimes, and then what we most often think of as extremism, terrorism,
Right.
acts of mass attacks, and then genocide is the extreme end of the spectrum.
Right.
And what I'm trying to educate folks about is that one, the way radicalization works is that an individual goes through a process. Sometimes it's an internal process, sometimes it's an external leader challenging them, going, am I doing enough for the cause?
Mm,
And once you're on that space of threats and intimidation, once you've broken that threshold of that norm, and it's okay for you to harass somebody, and maybe it's just online, right? Maybe it's,
right.
it's online, it doesn't count, right?
Right.
So when you're in that space and you're radicalizing and somebody challenges you, are you doing enough? And then you kind of self-reflect and go, no, I'm not doing enough, I need to do more. You start moving yourself up the pipeline of hostile action. Now,
Mm,
most people are not going to move to an act of terrorism. Like, this is a relatively very, very small percentage of people. The problem that we particularly have in this moment is that the size of people that are vulnerable, and then the size of people that have moved into at least cognitively accepting the idea that hostile action might be necessary, is quite large right now.
mm,
We have some studies that show between 30 to 40% of American adults agree with the statement that there are times when violence might be necessary to achieve my political aim. Now, Curtis,
wow.
that's the definition of terrorism under
Right.
some
Yeah.
definitions. Like,
Wow.
so we have 30 to 40% of Americans. That's like 80 to 120 million people who are like cognitively open to the idea that terrorism might be a necessary tool in my toolkit to get what I want. So clearly not 80 to 120 million people are going to go move and actually start doing some of this hostile action. It's going to be a much smaller subset. But when you're dealing with such a large starting potential pool, like
Yeah.
it that small percentage still turns out to be a large number of people. And in particular, in the post-COVID or the COVID experience in the post-COVID world, we have a lot of people operating in that non-violence but hostile action spectrum, that lower end of the spectrum. It's like what my mother would say is like, we've lost our ever-loving minds these days, where we just yell at people.
Yeah.
The poor 16-year-old serving you a drink at McDonald's, and you didn't get exactly what you want, and you just lose your mind on them. And
Right.
that kind of interaction is becoming more of a norm. And I do think that it will, hopefully we're in the ebb and flow of it where it's receding a bit, but it did break some of our norms. And one of these simple things we can do as adults, especially if you have kids, or especially if you are in a position of some sort of leadership in your community, we can reestablish those norms, and it actually makes it harder for people to move into that extremist space. If it's not acceptable behavior to yell at the school board when you're mad at them, then it becomes less likely that somebody's going to hear that narrative that they got to do more and they've got to be more hostile. So
Yeah.
some of this is just really simple. We've got to relearn how to be civil with one another, even when we disagree.
Yeah. So let me make sure I understand. 30 to 40% of Americans theoretically say political violence may be justified. The problem with that is that means there's a large pool of people that can move further down that funnel. It'll be a smaller and smaller number, but we're starting with a very large number of people who are already inclined to think that way and can move down that radicalization pipeline. Also, we have political leaders who are establishing a permission structure which actually encourages you to keep exploring, keep flirting with the next step of that pipeline, January 6th being the obvious example of that. And so that's going to actually widen that funnel of people who start moving next down that steps. And then just the sheer momentum of it is going to mean that some people will reach that point of actually entertaining seriously taking an act. What does your studies show about how much danger there is at that starting that really like active part of the funnel? I mean, clearly we're seeing hostile, aggressive reactions, like just like you said in McDonald's on the streets. It just seems like anger is boiling over. But how much are you seeing that is actually driving people to actual physical action, or at least seriously
Mhm.
contemplating physical action?
We are in the 10th year of ever increasing violence and plans or plots for attacks. Really, since 2015, we started to see a pretty drastic uptick. And I'm a little hopeful about this year. We might see a dip, except for the fact that it's an election year, and that is likely to lead to other types of tension. Look, the reason why people mobilize to violence or commit extremist acts are complex. It usually has to do with stuff in their background, their own personal grievances, but certainly a part of the mix is when your identity group is also experiencing grievances. It's difficult to know for sure who is going to be the person that mobilizes to violence, which is part of the reason why when we were looking for tools in the counterterrorism toolkit, if you will, to reduce the number of attacks we were seeing, we started to realize that we really have to work significantly upstream, well before somebody is ideating violence, to disrupt
Mm.
radicalization and hopefully, like, perhaps build protective factors in our community so that people don't radicalize to violence radicalize in the first place. And working upstream means that you're working with people and both groups and individuals that are most likely would never mobilize to violence. And that's a really important piece here, because I think when we're so used to, in the post 9/11 context, being able to label somebody, you're an extremist, you're therefore evil, you're the bad guy. And what we're trying to do is actually saying, like, before, because somebody does cross the criminal threshold and law enforcement has to deal with it, we now know lots of ways that we can intervene and off-ramp people. And the company I work for has this motto that I've co-opted because I think it's inherently also a great Christian motto. People can change.
Mm.
The drivers behind why somebody is susceptible to an extremist narrative often it's through no fault of their own. It's also often adverse childhood experiences,
Mm.
or just a run of bad luck, or just especially in the social media context, stumbling upon an influencer that the algorithm showed you that day, and it appealed to you, and now you're down the rabbit hole. And I'm not suggesting that people don't have agency or people don't have responsibility, but also the deck is highly stacked against us right now,
Right.
between societal factors that's just making life harder to be a human being, to factors within our own community. That the political discourse is increasingly just constant anger, constant grievance, us them context. Like, the deck is stacked against us,
Right.
and if you can
Well, and
approach it from
Elizabeth,
that
hold on for a
way.
second. I mean, let's
Yeah.
not forget the deck is also stacked against us from foreign governments that have an
Yes. That's
active
right.
interest in this election season to foment disruption and so forth. I mean, that's sort of novel in the broad sweep of recent American political history, right? That we have foreign governments that are
Totally.
actively investing large resources to radicalize Americans.
Yes, to create dissension, so discord, like This has been the finding of the intelligence community that's been released publicly since 2017, that Russia and then later Iran, China has more recently gotten in the game. North Korea tries, they're not as good as the others. But yes, they are intentionally using our First Amendment freedoms. They're trying to use it as a leverage and as a exploit to sow discord. And it's easy to see in retrospect, like you can have social scientists go back and be able to demonstrate this behavior was inauthentic, meaning it was not a real American that posted this thing on Facebook that went viral.
Yeah.
But of course, what makes it so messy is that you have maybe a Russian troll farm that seeded a bunch of stuff that goes viral, but then it's real Americans that are responding to that. But they're responding to something that was inauthentic to begin with. So you are flooded with these messages that like, oh, I just logged on today and apparently everybody's upset about this one thing. And like, ooh, which side am I going to choose here? Well, if you didn't have that in your feed, you maybe wouldn't have cared as much about whatever the controversy of the day is. And then maybe you would have had an in real life conversation with somebody, which is demonstrated to be much more productive. We're more likely to hear nuance. We're more likely to see different perspectives and when we're online in our echo chambers. So it's really hard to overstate the devastating effects of what what we call malign foreign influence has done on our state of mind as a country. Like we are definitely that increased polarization. They are a huge contributor to that.
Elizabeth, one of the things I just thought was so fascinating about your book was your background in counterterrorism, starting back with 9/11, and you drawing on the very robust literature that now exists on how Islamic extremism happens. That's been well researched, well studied. We sort of know how that happens. And what I thought was so interesting was you were adapting that framework that's been well established to the community that actually you know from the inside as a Christian, as an evangelical Christian. You're seeing, oh my gosh, these same frameworks are applicable to understanding what's happening to Christians today. So I want to ask you this question. Okay, what applies and what doesn't? Like, what of the model of extremism and radicalization you're saying, oh, this fits completely with what's happening to Christians? And then what do we need to say, well, actually, this is a little different?
Some of it is very time-based, right? So the nature of extremism has changed a lot in 2 decades. The post 9/11 context, Al Qaeda was focused on a complex, coordinated attack, and so to do that, we saw terrorists do things like need a lot of money, financing to be able to pay for travel, pay for supporting individuals for several years as they planned their external operation. You had a travel component; people travel to where the terrorist group is operating, get their training, and then go elsewhere. You needed a lot of cutouts. Needed it was cell style terrorism, so you had various people with various roles: the communicator, the money guy, people with tactical skills. If you're going to build a bomb, or in the case of 9/11, fly a plane, it takes a long time. Is the point. And when you have a long time, and you have a lot of people involved, and you have things like money and travel, you can build a protective system to detect those things and start to be able to pick what we would call back then the dots on the map, to start to connect the dots and be like, something's happening over here. We need to pay closer attention. Right. So a lot of our post 9/11 tools were focused on the complex coordinated attack. How do we detect it so that we can disrupt it? Meanwhile, that was to protect the homeland. Meanwhile, you have military and intelligence trying to go forward and find the terrorist and kill them. And that was our terrorist, our countering terrorism plans. Try to get rid of all the terrorists and protect the homeland from those complex coordinated attacks. Well, a couple of things happened. One, 20 years later, maybe it was more 15 years later, we started having some retrospective, some inward looks, and realizing that we had more terrorists 15 years later on the planet than we did on 9/11. So it's kind of a sobering look when you're in the counterterrorism community, if you think how many trillions of dollars we have spent
Mm.
on the war against terror, to realize that actually we have more terrorists now. So we weren't winning. Now, and we had not had or experienced another 9/11, and that is a huge success. For those that are old enough to remember, like it was really scary after 9/11. We just every time somebody flinched, we thought like, oh, they're coming again. And so it is a really big accomplishment that we haven't had another 9/11. At the same time, um, we had to acknowledge there was something else going on here because we're not defeating them. So
Yeah.
what more can we do? The other dynamic that shifted was the way in which people connected and the nature of the attacks themselves. 2009, 2010, social media comes onto the play, and terrorists use social media just like the rest of us did. And all of a sudden, we saw this big shift from radicalization occurring in person, one-on-one with people and in groups, to now it's almost 99% of cases are people radicalized online. And that radicalization space, or the process that occurs, it changes the nature of the ideology itself. It actually becomes less deep and more
Mm.
personalized, more atomized, if you will. It also happens much, much quicker. What we
Mm.
call the flash to bang is this space between somebody being initially engaging with the ideology to actually deciding to carry out an attack. It used to be years for people. Now the average is around 6 months. And then during my tenure, I was briefed on a case that had the flash to bang was 7 days.
Wow.
So if you're law enforcement and your job is to stop the next attack, you no longer have the complex attack that you're looking for all of the dots on the map. You have an individual that is a lone actor, radicalized online, maybe as recently as yesterday. And they don't have to plan very much. They can just pick up a gun in this country and wreak havoc, or they
Right.
can use a car, or they
Yeah.
can use a knife, right? Like the style changed drastically. And so it became much more difficult for law enforcement to detect.
So Elizabeth, let me just summarize what, like, almost visually what you're describing. The traditional old school, I suppose, back 9/11 era of thinking about political motivated violence, political terrorism, is like the cork board, where you've got photographs of all these different rows in a hierarchical structure, and you've got pieces of yarn tying leader to bomber to bomb maker to financier, and government can, and like they did on all these sort of Homeland
Jack Bauer,
episodes. Yeah,
yes,
Jack
yes,
Bauer
yes,
penetrates this cell and disrupts the terrorism. That's totally different now. Really, what
yes,
is happening now? It's this online message that seeps out to millions of people, finds in some individuals some fertile ground because of some highly individual factor that the individual has. They are depressed. They feel a great deal of shame. They are outraged. They've just lost their job and they blame it on immigrants. And then they, in a matter of days, can get converted through a marathon viewing of online videos, goes and picks up their gun that they already have, or goes and buys it and goes on a shooting rampage in some location. And that's what happens. That is the pathway, which is just really scary to realize how fast that can take. So Elizabeth, what evidence do we have that that's happening among Christian, at least self-purported Christians, Christian extremists? What would be some examples of recent even incidents? Because that doesn't really fit January 6th, right? January 6th was this
no.
mass event. So what would be examples that maybe people don't even realize would be the paradigmatic examples of this more common path to extremism?
Yeah, so it's funny. I really struggled with whether to label this Christian extremism. I went back and forth several times because usually when we label religious extremism, it's very inculcated within the religion itself. There's some sort of cleric that, or religious figure that is the one building the ideology. And we do have certain extremist groups that would fit that in the United States, like Christian Identity would be an example of
The white replacement theory proponents, right? Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So they're an example of a religious-based extremism.
Yeah.
But the thing that I'm labeling in the book is actually much broader than just the Christian faith. Christianity, for a number of people and a number of extremist movements, white nationalist movements, anti government extremist movements, as well as this mass political violence movement that we saw on January 6th, Christianity is the backdrop against which extremism is being developed, and those narratives are being developed. And Christianity is like this cultural marker for people when they're pinpointing whatever their grievances, what is wrong, what they're trying to fix, what's being stolen from them, their success or survival. It's this backdrop. And it might seem, especially since we've had so much conversation in the last year or so about Christian nationalism, that what I'm describing is just Christian nationalism. And the answer is yes, kind of. There is a segment of Christian nationalists. It's thankfully very small, that are building justifications for violence, and so it does put them into that extremist space, even if they're not necessarily doing the actions. They're building an ideological justification. They actually use scripture to justify why violence is totally appropriate to reinstall this Christian nationalist form of government. But it's not just the Christian nationalist small segment that justifies violence. We have lone actors that will frame themselves in their manifesto as fighting for Christendom, as fighting for reinstilling Christian values. The Buffalo Tops grocery store attacker from 2022, we just marked the 2-year anniversary of that horrific attack on the Black community in Buffalo. His manifesto, he explicitly says, I am not a Christian, but I am fighting for Christian values. I'm fighting for Christian culture. So it's important for Christians to understand that our faith is being used by extremists, especially white nationalists and especially anti-government extremists. They co-opt the faith for their purposes. Some of them might actually say, that they are, a believer, that Jesus died on the cross for my sins. Some of them might actually say those things and sound Christian-like. A whole lot of them are not. They're like, I'm not a born again believer, but this is a Christian country, right? And to us, when we're thinking about our faith very authentically and what it means to us, like that can sound really confusing, and you kind of want to just write those people off as crazy. What I'm trying to educate all of us on is that that is now increasingly influencing the mainstream. And this happens in a variety of ways. It happens through meme culture, which is particularly prominent for younger generations. If you have kids who are online at all, they have probably already seen extremist memes, which usually shocks people, but like it's just so ubiquitous right now. Like it is everywhere online, and half the time people don't even realize that that's what they're seeing or what people are commenting on. Like it's this very sarcastic, kind of joking way of talking about either the Great Replacement theory or white supremacy, or dehumanizing language towards whoever the outgroup might be. But that is increasingly a part of what we consider the mainstream culture. The Overton window has shifted. It used to be way off to the side. You would have to go dig for it. Somebody would have to email you something in order to get like the core propaganda. And now it shows up in our feeds. And so we need to be more aware of it because of that, so that when it does show up, we can detect like, that is a slippery slope towards, you don't even have to be about being anti-extremist. Just be biblical about it. Like we don't speak about fellow human beings in that way. Like they are made in the image of God, right? So there's a need to be more aware so that we can both equip our communities, our churches, our kids, and kind of reestablish those civil norms, and make sure that this doesn't further erode what is already a very fractured society.
Elizabeth, take a moment to bottom line this threat for us, specifically on Christian extremism and Christian violent action. That, again, I'm using air quotes around Christian, obviously, here. But like, let's say in the last 3 years, what would you say are the actual numbers of actual hostile, violent acts committed by quote unquote Christian extremists?
I think that's a good question. The best way I can answer the question is that most of and I want to be clear here, I'm talking about extremist violence, because there's different sets of metrics that do targeted violence, which is an act of violence that's occurred, that kills, depending on the metric, 3 or 4 people at a time, that's been premeditated. But we might not know that there's a ideological component to it. Example of targeted violence is the Las Vegas massacre that occurred in 2018. We never knew his prime ideology, so it was never labeled an act of terrorism, even though it might meet in our minds a vision of what an act of terrorism is. So of those where we know the ideological motivation, the preponderance of those that actually are lethal, that kill people, come from the white nationalist and anti-government extremist bucket. Now, there are some examples of people from the far left that have participated in extremism in the context of usually threats to property, or vandalism, or riots, or we also end up with protest, counter-protest types of activity. The far left tends to not premeditate mass attacks. So when I'm saying that it's primarily coming from the far right, I'm not making a political case. I'm just telling you the data. The data shows us that most deaths, actually going back to the 1990s, most terroristic type of deaths in this country have not come from ISIS or Al Qaeda, with the lone exception of 9/11. That's definitely the outlier. But if you take 9/11 data out of it, the preponderance of deaths, attacks, and plots in this country come from white nationalist and anti-government extremist attackers.
So if the predominance of threat is coming from white nationalists, anti-government, I'm imagining the typical listener to this is saying, well, I don't know any of these people. These people aren't going to my church. This isn't my problem. I mean, maybe it's a problem out there somewhere, but it's not a problem I should be concerned about because there's nothing I can do about it. Elizabeth, what would you say to those people?
Well, a couple of things. One, it's all of our problem because the violence keeps showing up in our neighborhoods. That we do have individuals within the church that are hurting and that need help. And that increasingly, because our churches are more engaged in politics than scripture, we have this severe problem of being formed, like our catechism or our Christian formation is occurring through politics and through grievance as opposed through scripture. And so really encouraging people back to the basics of the way of Jesus, back to the understanding of how Jesus views the challenges that our community is facing. That while, yes, we might increasingly be a post-Christian society, while, yes, we might increasingly have the libs or the coastal elites that are hostile to the way that our value system, that those might be true statements. Our answer, therefore, is not hostile action.
Yeah.
In fact, our answer is very clear in scripture, what God tells us to do when we are being persecuted and when we are suffering and when we are going through trials.
Well, Elizabeth, that was very much what I was thinking was when I was reading your book, I was like, oh yes, this is why we're doing the after party, is because we actually need to address the malformation of our people who are now increasingly tempted to use political action and especially political violence to solve human problems that only God and the spiritual power contained in the church can solve. And so part of the after party is to call people back to where our true hope for solving these ills and this despair we feel. So I want to thank you for sort of reminding me by writing this book of like why we're doing stuff like the after party and other initiatives like it. What's your sense of how effective something like the after party or similar initiatives in actually addressing some of these drivers that you're talking about?
I mean, I think it's so critical, Curtis. The challenge was like there's so much on the discipleship side that I feel like all I could do was just barely scrape the surface. But the beauty of getting, for me as the author, being able to dig in was to be able to unearth all of these resources that are there, written by amazing men and women of God who are deeply passionate about forming believers in the way after Jesus. And then to have you all have the after party come out last year, it was one of those moments where you're like, oh, thank you, Lord. I mean, like, this is exactly what people need. If you end up reading my book and you come to the end, you're like, okay, like, I have some work to do, or my community has some work to do, because we are so easily assuaged by the messages of politics, or by we don't have a good media diet, and we're easily caught up in the anger and the grievance cycle. The after party is a great next step to, like, dive into the true discipleship pieces that we need to start putting into place to what I'll translate it to my field, to build the protective factors so that you and your loved ones are resilient to those extremist narratives.
Elizabeth, I think you've made a really strong case that, look, government can't do it alone. It can't even do the heavy lifting, because of the nature of the threat has changed so much from organized cells plotting complicated efforts to really it's disaffected youth that are depressed, angry, not belonging to any hopeful narrative, that are resorting to this violence. And then that would seem like, well, that should be the church's role, to address precisely these people who are struggling ultimately with despair, with hopelessness, with anger, with shame. Let's get more specific. How could a specific church that says that say is in a community where such people, such that profile does exist, and I would say that pretty much describes almost every metropolitan area and rural area, right? Because of just how prevalent that profile of youth, young men especially, exist. What could a church, what just like describe for us, what could a local church do if it really felt like one of our calls to mission is to actually reach out and minister to that profile of person who happens to be the most dangerous profile, in terms of danger to go down that funnel path towards extremism? What could the local church do?
Yeah, so one of the things we understand about why people radicalize is that, and I should caveat, it's very complicated. There's no simple formula. There are trained professionals who can conduct threat assessments against a series of behaviors to determine how at risk somebody is. So what I'm about to share does not equip you or me, quite frankly, with being able to determine somebody's level of risk. But from a building protective factors perspective, I think this is helpful. The core unmet needs that exist when somebody moves into that extremist space is a need for significance and a need for belonging. And the need for significance usually has come up through some experience of humiliation. It can be a group humiliation, or it can be an individual humiliation. This is also why we often see and individuals that have become extremist, they often have experiences in childhood that meet that adverse childhood experience threshold. So there's something that has happened in their background, and usually there is some sort of recent trigger in their life that might be moving them into, kind of disrupts enough of the status quo, and it moves them into more, deeper extremism, deeper into that radicalization process, and possibly into mobilizing to violence. So if you're a community and you understand that belonging and significance are important, which Curtis, that's like, I'm just describing what basic human needs are, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? Like this, in some ways, this is not rocket science, but I will tell you, I have this hypothesis. I mentioned it briefly in the book, but the evidence, this is all like really new stuff that's come out in the last 2 years. And so the extremism community, the counter extremism community, has not yet done their research to be able to do the comparison. But my hypothesis is the reason we're seeing such a spike in violence starting in 2015, starting about 5 years after social media became prolific and available on smartphones. I think that the extremist targeted violence epidemic we are seeing is just one in a long list of social ills that are attributed to a society that is increasingly isolated, is increasingly lacking in finding significance in the traditional ways through face-to-face human relationships, and largely that is tied to what we have all kind of adapted or adopted in the last 15 years through our smartphones and social media. So it is a complex reason we are in the place that we're in. There are no simple solutions, but it is also a collective action problem in a place where churches could be just a sweet, safe place for parents that are trying to do this well and trying to help their kids. If you can create a community where the norm is that kids are not on smartphones, that is creating a space for kids to grow up a little bit healthier. So that's one thing, that we would put that in the primary prevention space. We're not yet talking about the individuals that are at risk.
Well, let's talk about the individuals at risk. Like, what if you are a listener and you start recognizing, I have a cousin that seems to be sharing videos that actually have some very disturbing content that seem to endorse violent action? What can an individual do in this situation?
Worth going down that path. What we find when people disengage from their extremist ideology, it's because they've become disillusioned. It doesn't actually meet their needs. It sometimes just takes time for them to realize that that narrative, that ideology, or that movement isn't meeting their needs. So your role, to the extent that it is safe for you, is to maintain a relationship and demonstrate love and empathy to the extent, like I said, that you can safely do so, with the hope that if they do decide, like, this is not working for me, you might be that safe person for them to come to. And then in that moment, you could offer to go find somebody, a counselor that can help them deal with those other issues. So that's probably the most important thing. It's not the message most people want to hear, but it is a message of, you pray for them, you're patient with them, you demonstrate grace and kindness and empathy and love. That's what people that are former extremists tell us, that they got disillusioned. Were held accountable often by, maybe they lost a job because somebody saw their Nazi tattoo, or they lost their kids in a custody dispute because of their extremist ideology. So often there's some sort of, accountability for their horrific beliefs that's forced them to go, like, maybe this isn't all it's cracked up to me. But then inevitably they also say there was somebody that showed them unexpected kindness and love that gave them an off ramp. I actually am really sad for the generation of folks that are moving into the professional world in the last 10 years, because they missed out on what examples of good leadership look like. I don't mean perfect leadership, but people whose intentions and heart were in the right place. And when you have it modeled for you that we can do hard things, we can walk through difficult times together. And for me, that was both the people I was working with, the community I was physically in, but it was also my faith community. My faith community prayed for me throughout my service in the Bush administration and in the Trump administration. When you realize that you're not alone, even on your hardest day, and sometimes that hard day is, we were attacked and a lot of people lost their lives today. And it's just, there is nothing but grieving that you can or say or do in those moments. But also there were hard days, especially in the Trump administration, when you were constantly attacked for trying to do the right thing. I don't know, when you go through hard crucible forming moments and you somehow survive and get to the other side by the grace of God, it allows you to say, I don't know what's coming. Like I end the book going, it might get really dark here, folks, like really dark. And we've got to be okay with that. Yeah. We've got to be okay with the fact that it might not be as great as our childhood was, that America might be in for really rough times. But that's why I started the book with, take heart, he has overcome the world. We have to lament together, and then find like-minded people who will keep pointing us back to Christ to help us take that next step through our trial or suffering.
Well, Elizabeth, thank you for being one of those people. Thank you for writing The Kingdom of Rage, and thank you for living the Kingdom of Hope. So we're grateful for you. Thank you for your time here with us.
Thank you, Curtis. It's such a thrill to be with you. And hello to all of the fellow Campfire listeners. It's like just such an honor to be doing this journey with all of you.
And indeed, once again, next week, join other listeners like Elizabeth when we gather around the campfire.